Welcome to IMTV. I'm Alan Keyes, and this is Let's Talk America. America has been talking a lot, of course, about the situation that most of us now find ourselves in. It leads me sometimes to be tempted to characterize all of this as kind of the un-America, like Bizarro World in the comic books. We are going through times that don't exactly look like our country. In response to the coronavirus threat, but also, if you start to think it through, which I hope to do with my guest today, in response to an agenda, a strategy that I think is aimed at systematically making sure that America becomes one of those things where the past is another country and we won't be living in it anymore. Can we do anything about it? How are we to understand the nature of the threats that are leading us in that direction, and can we stop it? These will be the topics that we'll be dealing with in the course of the next hour with a good friend of mine who knows a lot of whereof he speaks, particularly about how we might be able to fight back. So you sit right there, and we'll be right back. Hi, I'm Alan Keyes. I just want to let you know that on a recurring basis every Tuesday, we're going to have a guest, Mike Adams, the Health Ranger. He's going to be joining us to talk about the whole array of challenges, both in terms of our health as a people and as individuals, and our health as a nation. We'll be looking at those things through the eyes of someone who has thought deeply about many things and who has many great ideas to share with me and with you and with everyone who tunes in to Let's Talk America on Tuesdays, when we meet with the Health Ranger to talk about how we sustain the health of our liberty. Welcome back. Now, my special guest today is somebody I've known for many, many years, whom I've admired and worked with, and who represents to me the kind of commitment that we need to have. Activist, informed, well-educated, but also willing to stand with courage for the things that need to be done. He's a lawyer, which can help a lot given the things that need to be done these days. He is the founder, almost legendary, of a group called Judicial Watch, and also of a group that he's headed up for the last several years, of whom he is the leader and special counsel and lead prosecutor or litigator. His name is Larry Klayman. And it's a name well and favorably known to me and to everybody, I think, who has an activist love of liberty and wishes to see the people of the United States remain a free people, showing the capability to govern themselves and also understanding how to make use of our laws and Constitution and basic God-given rights to secure that liberty and hand it on to future generations for as long as God allows. Welcome to the show, Larry. And
is mutual, my good friend. Nice to
God
see you.
God bless you, sir. It's nice to see you, and it's great to see you hard at work in the midst of these very dangerous times. Now, I think that in point of fact, though people are throwing around the war metaphor and using references to Pearl Harbor and so forth to achieve various and assorted aims and ends, I actually think that the comparison to Pearl Harbor is quite accurate, though it has this limitation. We are under attack, but I think we're very unclear about who the enemy is. Day to day, you'll call it the coronavirus, but last time I looked, it is possible, at least these days, that just like nuclear weapons, we live in an era when there's a different kind of weapon that can be made use of against us. And so we might be faced with a very understandable and clear human adversary. And I think attention has to focus on the government of China and on a lot of the characteristics of their response to the coronavirus threat that raise deep suspicion and possibly even, and this is where I thought it would be good to have you talk to us a little bit today, culpability. That they need to be held accountable for what if it is what it looks like, and if it was a malevolent and premeditated thing, is a crime against humanity for which they should be called to account. Is that entirely inaccurate in the way I'm trying to describe it? And if it's not, how do you understand the nature of
No,
the
it's extremely accurate, and this
origin.
is much more powerful, much more dastardly, much more deadly than Pearl Harbor. I mean, we're talking about millions and millions of people around the world are being infected with the coronavirus, COVID-19. And let me put it in the context of a lawsuit that we brought last week in Dallas, Texas, and another lawsuit that we brought after that in Tel Aviv, Israel, and a criminal complaint that we filed in The Hague, Holland. All of this working together is that the only Chinese bioweapon laboratory facility is in Wuhan, China. And there's a lot of circumstantial evidence here, Alan, that this was a bioweapon that either was released on purpose or inadvertently, which now has infected the entire world and brought us to our knees, both in terms of our health and economically. Now, Chinese bioweapons, like any bioweapons, are illegal under the Geneva Conventions and other international treaties. And therefore, the government of China, this communist government, this dictatorship, has no immunity from a lawsuit. So I filed a case on behalf of a company, Buzz Photos, in Dallas, Texas. I'm a lawyer in that court in the Northern District of Texas, among others. And it's a class action lawsuit. I'm also a plaintiff, and so is Freedom Watch, because we're affected. It's affecting us economically and otherwise. And already 700 people plus have signed up as putative plaintiffs. And the theory of this case is that this was released. It is harming the people of the United States and elsewhere, and that China should be paying for this massive damage that's been caused, not the American taxpayer. Our treasury should not be emptied out, because we're going to have to pay that back. Our kids and grandchildren are going to be living in abject poverty, but China should have to pay the damage. And I don't hear that coming out of our government. In fact, just yesterday, the Attorney General Barr, interviewed by Laura Ingraham on her show on Fox News, was asked, what are you going to do about this? And he says, oh, we're going after Chinese intellectual property theft. That's not what we're talking about here. And the president, he's been trying to be diplomatic. He's doing his best in a difficult situation, but he doesn't want to go after China either, because we became dependent on their pharmaceuticals and other products, not just with regard to this crisis, but other crises, which is a problem. But the Chinese need to pay. They need to be held accountable. And the leadership in Beijing, this President Xi, who always has the smile, looks like a nice guy. He's no nice guy. These people have slaughtered tens of thousands of their own people to keep them quiet. They need to be held accountable. So I filed a complaint, even though the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, Holland. And within 48 hours, I got notification that the complaint is being processed. On top of that, I'm getting calls from all around the world. We filed a case in Israel. I have Israeli colleagues, as I said, same kind of case, class action. We know that there are whistleblowers that will come forward with information that this was a bioweapon throughout the world. I'm hearing from India. I'm hearing from Argentina. I'm hearing from Italy, Spain, Asia, Africa, Nigeria, Lesotho. Well, lawyers around the world want to do the same thing, and I'm helping them, and we're amassing this group of people also in this country, because we're going to have a huge amount of plaintiffs to represent. So I could use, if I can do a little advertisement here, we could use the financial support. Go to freedomwatchusa.org with tax-deductible contributions, because this is expensive. And also sign up to be a class action plaintiff. But this is the theory. Why should the American taxpayer have to pay for this damage? China should have to pay, and the leadership should be indicted, convicted, and thrown in prison with the key thrown away.
Well, let's take a moment to walk through what I think are some of the, shall we call it, anomalies in the way in which the Chinese government conducted itself that point to responsibility of one kind or another. I think some of it gives rise to the suspicion that there was something more that they were hiding than just the fight they were making against this virus in the beginning. And second, there is the indisputable fact that they knew what was going on and they knew what the danger was, and withheld, not only withheld action to tell the rest of the world what was going on, but withheld it during a period and for so long that it had time to be spread with commerce with China and people from China going to different places in the world, it had the opportunity to be spread throughout the earth. It started out as a threat, a localized threat. It became a pandemic because of their overt attempts to suppress the world's knowledge of it, including one that by many reports I've seen included killing or otherwise removing from the scene a couple of people who wanted to blow the whistle. First of all, is this accurate in terms of, in your sense of what you've been reading, what you've been seeing? And second, what are its implications for the kind of actions that you're taking? It sounds to me like there's a lot of things that need to be gone through to become part of the evidence that I think suggests culpability here.
Whether this was a release of the coronavirus, COVID-19, by design or accidentally, it is most likely a bioweapon. But even if it's not a bioweapon, which I believe it is, and many other experts as well, in fact, there's a good documentary that came out just last week on Epic Times. You can find it at freedomwatchusa.org, which with experts analyzes this. What the Chinese did, their leadership, was a violation of World Health Organization regulations. And China is a signatory to that. That's part of the United Nations. You know, you were a UN ambassador. And that would also remove their immunity from suit because they have violated international treaties. Now, one of the things I wanted to point out, this is a very evil communist Chinese regime in Beijing. Don't be fooled by the smiles on the face of President Xi. Okay, that's for public consumption worldwide. But this should not be held against Chinese Americans and Asian Americans in the United States. Over 30% of the people that signed up for our class action in Dallas are Chinese Americans and Asian Americans. They're patriotic. They fled this dictatorship, many of them. This is a communist regime, and they are now, in effect, teaming up with the left in this country to destroy this country. And they won't admit, the left, that this was likely a bioweapon or that World Health Organization regulations allow for a lawsuit, because frankly, they see an opportunity here to transform the country. We're bailing out industries and private parties with trillions and trillions of dollars. We've socialized this country already. Once you go there, it'll probably never go back completely. Look at Obamacare. Once we had that, you couldn't get rid of it. And couple that with the draconian orders of several state governors, most of them Democrat, ordering people to stay home or they'll be arrested and thrown in prison. And what you have is the equivalent of a Soviet gulag. So the left is jumping for joy. And they are criticizing our lawsuit, predictably, because we have attacked China. And of course, Mao is their hero. Mao, Lenin, Trotsky, Marx, those are their heroes. So they can find nothing wrong that the Chinese do. So it's a 1-2 punch. You got the communist leadership in Beijing, and you've got the left in this country, and they are teaming up in parallel to change the entire fabric of this country as the way they want it.
Yeah. Well, so that folks listening don't think that this is just something one is pulling out of a hat. I was reading the other day a timeline that was put together by the folks over at the Center for Security Policy, going through from the side of the Chinese, the timeline. And what's interesting is that from the time that the first victim was identified over there, which was the middle of November, 17th of November, I think, you then had a certain amount of time while they were supposedly identifying what the virus was and doing other things with it. Now, you put that together with the fact that they, and this is one of the reported murders, that there was a gentleman who wanted to share this with the rest of the world early on. Once they had identified it, knew the problem they were dealing with, wanted to share it, they not only took his life, reportedly, but they destroyed all the evidence that was associated with that initial identification that this was, in fact, a novel version of the coronavirus. What could possibly explain the destruction of that evidence? Well, I don't think that makes any sense at all unless
the Chinese are guilty. Circumstantial evidence is admissible in court, you know, Alan.
Yep.
And it's as powerful as direct evidence. And you put 2 and 2 together and it equals 4. If it's a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And that's what you've got here. And there's no doubt that the Chinese manufactured this bioweapon. You know, the left is saying, oh, well, it just came out of a Chinese market from some bat, B-A-T. Well, you know what? It came from a bat and it was engineered inside a laboratory to make it particularly harmful to infect humans. The Chinese amplified it. Now, we know that nearly all countries have developed bioweapons. This country has developed them too. You remember the anthrax attacks after 9/11? That was a strain that was developed in a lab in Virginia by our military. We sold it. George W. Bush, not one of our favorites, and Rumsfeld and Cheney sold it, or at least gave it to Saddam Hussein. Somehow it got loose. Well, that's what likely happened here as well, either by design or accidentally. And these bioweapons are outlawed. They're terrorist weapons. And that's why China is extremely vulnerable legally here. And you know, what you just said is outlined in our lawsuit. You can see it at freedomwatchusa.org. We went through it in excruciating detail. And I call your attention also on that website to this piece by Epoch Times, which in a very scholarly way says exactly what you're saying. They back it up with expert evidence.
And I think it's a telling sign, and one that reveals the kind of situation that the Chinese government is actually in, the communist Chinese government is actually in, that they want to take such pains to try to distract attention from where this all originated. And they then followed up on that by trying to spread a propaganda line that somehow or another it originated with U.S. government activities and so forth. But I went back, you go back and you look at some of the things that occurred at the very beginning when they were talking about it. You read in the paper novel strain of the coronavirus. It was scientifically identified in the beginning as the Wuhan coronavirus, right? With the letters, I think, WHCV identified. So that's why at first it was called the Wuhan virus. It wasn't Donald Trump trying to be a racist or anything. That were just scientists who were talking about it with that designation. And it was only later that they identified it by the year of the outbreak, 2019. And even the Chinese themselves called it the Wuhan virus, right? In their own talking to each other.
Right.
So the notion that this is somehow racist and you can't do it anymore, not only doesn't track with the facts, but it also aims to establish a world in which, once you've erased all the evidence and so forth and so on, you can induce people to forget that it ever came from the Chinese. Now, who would want you most to forget that it had anything to do with overt either activity or neglect by the Communist Chinese government? Well, the Communist Chinese government, obviously. And I think these are telling signs that they took pains to suppress the evidence, that they objected to any version of events that would actually leave on the record the idea that it was identified with their activities, that it came into the world. And then there's the final point. There's no doubt, I think, in every account that I've seen, that they didn't take the steps required to notify the world of the problem and to seek help and coordinated help, which is what's supposed to happen. That's why the WHO exists, and they prevented it from happening by suppressing and penalizing anybody who wanted to go through those proper channels. They shut them down, and reports have it killed them. Now, you could have two reasons. One of them would be you did it and you're trying to harm the whole world, but they harm the whole world just by continuing the ignorance. Because literally millions of Chinese people traveled back and forth, went to other countries for various reasons, including Chinese New Year celebrations, so forth and so on, where families get together. And all this took place while the world was essentially in ignorance of what was actually happening. And they wanted it that way because they were suppressing it. Isn't that further evidence that they are culpable? In other words, either through their actual origination or willful neglect with a studied, conscious purpose and intention in mind, which is to avoid economic harm, for instance, to their situation, they let the world be ignorant of this. I think that's not just a crime, it's a crime against the whole of humanity.
It is, and that's why there is likely going to be a criminal proceeding against the Chinese leadership in The Hague, Holland. Even the Europeans are up in arms. Look, they've suffered greatly, so the Europeans have gotten a wake-up call. and they're going to have to do something here. But there's other circumstantial evidence too. If you take the Chinese at face value, which is hard to do because they don't tell the truth very often, if at all, and they have put in arrest, they've stopped the proliferation of this virus. How are they able to do it so quickly? They obviously knew how it was engineered. They probably have vaccines that they're not making available to the rest of the world or some other measures. And therefore, their country is now suffering much less than our country and other regions. Now, that's a very important thing to remember. But there's another flip side to this, Alan. I think you can appreciate it. Our deep state, which is embedded in the CIA, in the National Security Agency, in the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the FBI, that deep state that tried on 3 prior occasions to remove President Trump through Russian witch hunts, Ukrainian witch hunts, and then an impeachment proceeding. That deep state, which wiretapped the president, his family, his friends, and his colleagues, and induced false warrants to be issued by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance State Court, they had to have known from the beginning what was happening in Wuhan, China. We have this mass surveillance. We can train it on the American people, hundreds of millions of people. We have satellite capabilities. We have assets on the ground. A lot of Americans, Chinese Americans are in the CIA and elsewhere, and our resources there, their assets. I believe that they withheld this information from President Trump to set him up, to try to bring him down as a result of this pandemic. I think that's something that needs to be investigated, and I have a lawsuit on that too. You can see it at freedomwatchusa.org, a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit to try to obtain the documents from these intelligence agencies. What did they know, and when did they know it?
Well, one of the things I really appreciate about you, Larry, is that if you are somebody who sits back and tries to see the logical trains of events, right? And then you identify questions that need to be answered. You are one of those folks who never hesitates to go after the answer to those questions. A question about the behavior of the Chinese government itself because it looks suspicious. A question about the failures of what would be failures, but what were probably part of some agenda on the part of the deep state, because the reports are now clear that they did get wind of this toward the end of November. Even the mainstream media is reporting this. They're claiming that it was included in briefings for the president and so forth, but a lot depends when that information is around as to what is being made of it. So why wasn't the threatening nature of this developed early on so that that intelligence actually became something that people were thinking about as a basis for defending this country against a possible threat? Didn't happen. And final point, when the Chinese government has put out their little propaganda things to try to shut everybody up, you can't call it the Chinese virus, you can't call it the Wuhan virus, even though they themselves did so in the first stages of the discussion amongst themselves, and there's evidence of that. But we can't do it because it might be too much truth, I suppose, I don't know. But the WHO parroted their propaganda line, and many American news outlets did the same. That looks to me to be something that raises another question about the nature of the response of certain elements of our own public and particularly our media. And I want to talk about that with Larry because I know he won't hesitate to draw the consequences that have to be considered from those facts.
More IMTV episodes? We are now streaming through Roku. Roku is a device that enables you to stream entertainment to your TV through your internet provider. The starting price is only $29, and you can purchase one either online or through your local electronics retailer. It's easy to use, and you won't have to worry about missing any more IMTV episodes. IMTV, changing the world.
Podcasts are great when you're a multitasking person. You can listen to them around the house, when you're out in the car, when you take a walk. Now we have put our shows on to podcasts, and you can listen to Let's Talk America on podcasts. You can find them at Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Anchor FM, and other apps. While you're there, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on our new episodes. Thanks for listening and supporting us. Together, we're changing the world. Welcome back. I'm talking to my good friend, the legal activist and patriot Larry Klayman, who, as I think, never hesitated not only to see the nature of threats to the preservation of our liberty, threats to the preservation of our constitutional sovereignty as a people, but has spoken out about those threats and has been active in trying to make use of the opportunities we have and the nature of our legal system, which provides those opportunities, if you're creative, to use them in order to focus attention on these threats in such a way that people can gain from what he does information that then becomes essential to the kind of decisions we should be making at the polls. We are the sovereign people of the United States, but one of the things that every kind of sovereign depends on is accurate intelligence. And accurate intelligence is precisely, Larry, what I think a lot of our media has conspired to deprive us of in this case. Now, when you link that to certain other coincidences, this resonates with the ideological agenda, statements, and activities of people who actually have been seeking, we could say transform, I have to say overthrow our way of life, rooted in the sovereignty of a responsible, moral people who then are to operate in such a way that the government that they have over them is a government that responds to ultimately to their rational, responsible political will in a way that respects the God-given unalienable rights that were the basis for the assertion of that sovereignty of our people. Don't you think the way the media has been behaving suggests that there's more at work here than just anti-Trump feeling? I think there's an agenda at work that actually aims to overthrow the sovereignty of the American people.
Yes, I was trying to be diplomatic. You've been the diplomat, and I was trying to be diplomatic. But you said it straight. It's absolutely right. And look, the left does have an affection for communist China. The left moves left. The left worships Mao, worships Marx, worships Trotsky, Alinsky in modern times, others. Communism is growing in this country. Joseph McCarthy would have a field day in today's United States, notwithstanding a few abuses that he committed, but he was absolutely right, but it took longer to develop. And we see that with the rise of Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and the whole lot of them, is that they are grabbing onto this as a way to destroy this country. And even if they were adverse to the leadership in Beijing, which they're not, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And the deep state, which I believe set the president up on this, who certainly can surveil you and me at will, but yet they can't figure out what's going on in Wuhan, China, if you believe that. I don't know that they ever thought it was going to get this severe, but they thought it was going to weaken the president to the point where they could affect the elections, hopefully to take place this fall in 2020. And it's gotten out of hand. So that's where the enemy of my enemy is my friend comes into play, is that the Chinese leadership, those communists in Beijing, are very useful tools of those at the CIA, the NSA, and the intelligence agencies, and the FBI that want to get rid of this president.
Well, doesn't that suggest that while they were running after so-called collusion with the Russians, what the American people should have their eye on right now is what appears to be a resonance, shall we call it, a harmony in terms of the sounding result between the agenda of the Chinese communist regime, which is taking advantage in every way of the present situation to make its move, to push the United States aside and become unequivocally the focal point of power in the world in which we live. I have been reading articles in European countries, the one recently in Le Monde that had in it a reference to the post-American era. And I'm thinking to myself, well, that's very interesting. Are they talking about America's leadership or America's existence? And you really can't tell from the title or the article, to be quite frank about it. But The idea is that somehow or another what's going on is going to so change the world that our presence in it is no longer as influential and decisive as it became after World War II and as it sustained itself in being for quite a long time thereafter. Well, that suggests an agenda that's then being parroted almost wholesale by institutions like the WHO, where we still give, by the way, because we contribute to the UN, a lion's share of the money that supports it. But it's now been talking and acting as if it's just a wing of the Chinese Communist Party. And the same could be said in many respects of the American media. Is this an orchestrated effort that's going on tacitly
Yes.
or in other ways? And what is the ultimate aim of what's happening?
Well, they all see an opportunity here. And whether they have a total affinity to each other or not, they have a common purpose. And that's to destroy the United States. You're absolutely correct. And this is why we cannot fight a defensive battle. And I urge the president, it's not enough just to say this is a Chinese virus. And it's not enough to say President Xi is my friend and China has integrity. Now, who's he kidding? You know, we like the president, we support him, but you know what? They're not our friend. They want to destroy us. So talk straight to the American people, and it's time to fight back. And I am sending out a message right now. I hope that your viewers will do this, to contact the president at the White House and say, have your Justice Department, if you want to call it that, join Freedom Watch in these lawsuits, and also with regard to criminal proceedings that should be started against the Chinese leadership. And the least you could do right now is to freeze the assets of the Chinese in this country, because that's how we're going to collect on this judgment. Freeze them. Because once we get a jury verdict, and I'm confident that we can, we're going to need to collect. And the Chinese have hundreds of billions of dollars in U.S. banks, in securities, in CDs, and other investments in this country. And they need to pay. And we cannot be afraid of them because they know what they're doing. And Alan, again, you have to ask the question, how is it that China now claims to have contained this virus so quickly? How is it they were prepared for something like this? And
well, I have read things that suggest, Larry, that they were prepared at least partly because they ran around the world buying up all the masks and even respirators and other things that they could get their hands on.
Well, that's right. And, you know, in addition to that, you know, what are they doing today to help us, as you pointed out? Nothing. So they're sitting back and waiting for the United States and the rest of the Western world to be destroyed, and they will fill the vacuum. And as you know, the Chinese have been doing this for years. They've been buying up utilities throughout the world, telephone companies, electric companies, the Panama Canal. They control the Panama Canal, strategic waterway. They're very smart. They play the long game. They don't play the short game. And they are now on the cusp of total world control and dominance, as we're basically, you know, coughing our way to death with the coronavirus.
Well, what do you think now? If we identify the situation we're in, we understand, if I can put it this way, the enmity that is driving forces, whether it's the Chinese Communist government, whether it's other forces abroad, and then also has its reflection in what would at one time have been called fifth column elements, but they mean elements of our domestic public that are actually acting in sympathy and resonance with the aims and agenda and strategy of those who have an enmity toward our self-government, our constitutional system, and the preservation of our liberty. Okay, with all these things in mind, as you contemplate the steps ahead, and looking away to the broad picture as well as to the legal picture, what are the things that we need to be wary of, and what should we be doing? After all, right now, as you have pointed out, there's a surrender of liberty. It's so great that I got into a discussion the other day with someone, not someone who is, you know, a big opponent or leftist or anything, but someone who would identify himself as a conservative, a defender of liberty, and so forth and so on. And he actually referred to the era we live in as the post-constitutional era, a phrase that would never come out of my mouth, because I think even if they're ignoring it, it's still there and it still governs if we have the guts to make sure that the truth of it is articulated and we fight for it. We
That's
might
right.
come to blows to make that decision stick, but if we let them get away with defining the era we're in as one in which the Constitution is already obsolete, then we won't have much left to fight for, except in an abstract way. So I objected to the use of the term, but they are thinking that they have pushed us so far off the beam that we can never return. Is that right?
It's absolutely right. And one other lawsuit that I brought, won't be the last, was for Ben Stein. You know Ben.
Mm-hmm.
Ben is the Hollywood actor, writer, comedian, financial expert, well, he is a Yale lawyer. Not that going to Yale is makes you the brilliant person in the world. I think you went to Yale too. I went to Duke. Doesn't make me
Well,
bright.
I went to Harvard, actually, but
Harvard. Okay, good. Right.
unfortunately, in terms of the bad implications of that, you have to kind of spend the rest of your life overcoming them if you're a conservative.
Well, absolutely. Duke has become the Berkeley of the South, so I have the same problem. But Ben brought a lawsuit. I brought it for him against the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, for his draconian order, ordering people to stay at home or they would be arrested. And he has a Filipino friend who's a pastor in downtown Los Angeles. The police threatened him with arrest for simply meeting with 10 people to pray. He had two other friends going through a park in Los Angeles with their dog, not near anyone. And they were also threatened with arrest and fined. And this is being used as an opportunity by the left. Of course, Gavin Newsom, much like Andrew Cuomo, has presidential aspirations. They're using this to take control, to get their bona fides with the left, because the left believes in total government control. That's their God. Government is the God of the left. And now this is their opportunity to take total control of the American people.
And I think it shows itself in many ways, one of them being that the leftists are gung-ho to define abortion clinics as essential services during this period, so that because we're fighting for our lives against the virus, this would be the paradigm, we must take the lives of the future generations. And because we're faced with possible mass deaths, if you look at the models they had been using, therefore we should be doing everything in our power to make sure people are deciding against replacing our population. This is an essential service that you have to do to the future of the country. I don't get this reasoning. I don't get its implications, except in terms of the fact that the people who are using it, when they claim that they are somehow doing so in the best interest of the American people and the poor and all of this, they're just liars. Because abortion serves not a whit any of those interests. And yet they are promoting that. And then they're trying to tell us that church services aren't essential services. And I often point out to people, Larry, that, well, let's see. We live in a country where the first words with which we asserted our independence as a people included relying on the laws of nature and of nature's God, and a understanding of rights, which is to say the exercise of right, the doing of what is right, which then becomes it then becomes the purpose of government to protect. The understanding of that term is that it's a God-endowed, a creator-endowed, unalienable right, including, of course, liberty. I would think it would be pretty essential if we're going to know what we're fighting for against whoever. Could be the Chi-Coms, could be the coronavirus, but whatever you're fighting against, I always thought that that understanding of who we are as a people is what we are fighting for. But things that are deeply related to it, which include the worship of God and the understanding that his authority matters, they now say that it's not an essential service. That
No, of course
people should
not,
be trying to do that. Isn't this transparently part of an agenda to knock the stilts out from under our whole way of life?
Well, ask yourself this question. Is this pandemic the result of the devil? Is it? Does he have his hand in it? Is what is at play? Or is God teaching us a lesson too, like he did many other times? You know, we're at Passover right now. Certainly taught the Egyptians a lesson to free the Jews to find the promised land. I wonder whether we're paying the price for a lot of moral and ethical decadence and decay over many, many years. Maybe this is a wake-up call. Maybe God is trying to unite us, to bring us together. But now is the time that we really need God, and to squeeze that out of our body politic and our lives is frightening. it leaves us exposed.
And I think it's especially redolent with this message that is so compatible with the agenda you've been talking about, that has been at work for decades throughout pretty much the whole of the 20th century in one way or another in America. It contributed to some of the things done during the so-called progressive era, which turns out to be a regression away from self-government toward the consolidation of power in the hands of a few. Why anybody ever called that progressive, I don't know, but they did. And it's been all at work. And banishing God seems to be part of it, because you can't be worshiping government if you are still worshiping God. And if your first resort in the midst of trouble is to call on God, then you are not going to treat the edicts of your government as if they are automatically edicts of God, and succumb to them when a tyranny is being imposed on you. Isn't that the nature of the deep coordination? I mean, I think that in some ways that's the deep in deep state. There's a deep coordination of hostility toward the very ground on which the institutions, but also the identity of our nation stands.
Well, that's right. And that's why I say, now is the time that God wants us to come to him. He wants us to be humble, to change our way of doing things, I believe. And we have some enemies that are out there that need to be dealt with, and we need his help to do it. It's a big, broad picture here, Alan, and you're one of the best people to articulate it as a religious person, and I am too, and many conservatives and people of faith are as well. But the left absolutely abhors God, and they're doing the work of the devil right now, frankly. I mean, they'd like to destroy him, and they'd like to destroy us, in the process, the baby and the bathwater.
Mm. Well, one of the things I try to do, because I've been talking to folks a lot, obviously, about this, but especially to someone who has the background of understanding both of our Constitution and our laws, the president is right now getting advice, formal and informal, from a whole range of sources. Some of them, I think, a little suspect, because they are part of the very apparatus of the bureaucracy that seems intent on undermining the constitutional sovereignty of our people. But he's getting it from other sources, including, I noticed the other day, because you took him to task a little bit, Judge Napolitano. And he's giving him various forms of advice, and people have been doing that from various quarters. If you, Larry Klayman, were going to give the president 2 or 3 really fundamental pieces of advice as to not only how you deal with the crisis, but how you make sure that on the other side of it, we emerge stronger in our identity and in the institutions and understanding that make us a free people, what would you say?
Well, first of all, talk clearly and be consistent. The president's doing the right thing now. He's letting people know that he's actively at work with his team, and that there is a ray of light at the end of the tunnel. In the beginning, we weren't sure where he stood on that. He needs to talk consistently. Secondly, he does need to get better advisors around him. Napolitano's not one of them. Napolitano's become anti-Trump, as a matter of fact, and has been attacking him for many, many months. He dissed our lawsuits. He's totally wrong about immunity. He's wrong about the International Criminal Court. And of course, the president needs to start getting those advisors from the best and brightest in this country, not just those who appear on Fox News. And that's been a weakness in the past, is that he sees people on Fox News and he thinks they're experts. Well, they're not experts. They're pundits, and they want to help Fox News make money. Right now, it's not about making money. It's about saving this country. And I would recommend that. And then last but not least, he needs to confront the Chinese. It's not enough to say the Chinese virus. He needs to say, your assets are frozen right now. We're going to pay for this, like he said with the wall in Mexico, from China. China should have to pay for this damage, and you're not removing 1 cent from this country until you pay for it. And I would do that. And then leave it to Freedom Watch and the American people to bring the lawsuits to collect. And again, go to freedomwatchusa.org, sign up as a putative plaintiff if you qualify. And like I said, we've got about 700 already, and we're going to have thousands, maybe tens of thousands of plaintiffs. And we're amassing a team of lawyers to do that. And we need your financial support, tax-deductible contributions. It's going to be expensive.
Well, I noticed that in the you have a form that people can use to sort of indicate their interest. in doing so. And you ask them to tell the ways in which they have been directly themselves damaged by what has been rendered necessary by this threat from the coronavirus. Could you give them a few suggestions? Because I found myself sitting there trying to do a little inventory in my mind of not just myself, but people I know. But you've probably been thinking a lot more and better about that. What kinds of things do you think would be worth noting that people might not realize that's part of the damage you're suffering?
Well, yes. I mean, obviously, damage to your health, damage to your emotional well-being. People have, even families are starting to panic, and family members are turning against each other if they get too close to each other. It's causing lots of issues. Damage to your wages, losing your job, damages to your business, losing your business, damages to your reputation if you can't perform what you've agreed to perform as a result of this virulent virus. There are many forms of damage, and I would say that virtually everybody in this country, in fact, everybody has been damaged. Anybody can be a plaintiff for this, at this point, because we've all been damaged.
Now, the last thing that's much on my mind these days, because I think that in addition to everything else, and long before coronaviruses and everything else, I think there was a degree of viral ignorance about the nature of the character of the American people and the premises of our Constitution that we must continue to understand, apply, and respect, which then requires knowledge, that has been increasingly rampant, particularly on account of what's been going on in our so-called education institutions, where they really seem to be doing their best, in fact, to make people ignorant of some of the basic premises of American life, and especially of the character, and I mean the character of self-discipline, morality, courage, and things like this that are needed. Now, we're in the midst of a crisis that plays a lot on fear, and I've heard very little discussion of the way in which it also is demanding that the American people show two things: self-discipline and courage. Isn't that, though people may think it's terrible, kind of a silver lining in all of this? Because ever since Eric Holder called us a nation of cowards, I have been fuming and hoping that the American people would have an opportunity to show that, just as in past generations, one of our chief characteristics is an informed and responsible courage. Don't you think we not only have an opportunity to show that now, but in the way we respond, not just to the virus, but to all the political shenanigans that people are now trying to perpetrate against our institutions?
Right.
Isn't that a chance for us to show something positive about who we know we are?
It's probably our last chance. And one of the lessons here is that all these witch hunts and impeachments caused the president to perhaps not be as cognizant of what was going on as he would have been if he wasn't under siege and under attack. And I don't blame him for that. But that's a lesson. And we do need to bring people together. And our universities are very important. I talked about, my once proud alma mater. I love Duke University, but I'll tell you something. It's gone so far left. It's beyond the pale. Just last year, the president cut off funding because the University of North Carolina and Duke were sponsoring a course that Islam is a better religion than Judaism and Christianity. I mean, this is where we are today. And these universities need to play a role in educating the young people in this country about all of the various virtues you've just discussed, but also commitment. Let me add one other point. It's also off point to some degree, but it's been a bone in my side. Duke alumni are very proud of its basketball program. Okay, it's been very successful over the last several decades. Well, this one and done concept, where you go to Duke University or Stanford or any other school, not the Ivies, and you go only for 1 year and you don't want to get a degree, that's not what it's all about. It's not about you. It's about the student body. It's about what your institution stands for. And those institutions have failed the American people, and they're turning out the kind of people that will not stand up to these communist Chinese. On the contrary, they probably admire them, and that's really frightening.
I think you have put your finger on something that's absolutely vital. I hope and pray that we'll be able to get together again and go more deeply into some of those aspects of the challenges that lie ahead of us as well. Thank you for being with me today, Larry. And I hope all of you out there understand what a precious resource Larry Klayman and his work and Freedom Watch represent. They are the cutting edge in the literal sense of what I think may help us to get through this crisis in a way that greatly strengthens the prospect of our survival as a free people. So, a lot of good and I think deeply important information conveyed today. Ponder it and then join us again here at Let's Talk America.